the next show coming up for the tunnel is
While Rome Burns on the 10th
While Rome
of
Burns
October.
on the 10th of October. Should we talk a bit about what the title's based on, or like sort of the idea of it, or?
Well, you need to talk about that, don't you? 'Cause it's based on one of your paintings, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's based on a digital art piece I made called, well, called the same as the show title, so it's Whilst Rome Burns. The connotations are fairly obvious, I guess. It's to do with the current crisis that we're going through and the sort of the political responses to that, I guess, all the world over, largely in
And
America, but also in Britain.
people are profiteering from it, basically.
Yeah,
Making a lot of money. Like people are profiteering from Brexit,
yeah, of course. Whenever
in
there's
this
a crisis,
country.
unfortunately, people will try and capitalize on it, I suppose.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, obviously the title's based on.
It's frustrating because there's so many solutions and they don't want that. They just want to make money. They don't want to engage meaningfully the world. They just simply want to line their pockets, which is so absurd. It's just nihilistic, self-destructive behaviour.
Unfortunately, it's always the way, isn't it? I suppose. But
Yeah.
So it's a fairly obvious title, I guess. It's just sort of like, well, obviously it's based on the phrase "while Rome burns while Nero fiddles," which is a phrase from antiquity, I suppose. And I was just thought of that when I was making the piece because it's basically the piece itself is a collage of various other pieces I did. Like I did this piece painting a few years ago, which had a figure with a mask on, like very much like the masks that we wear these days, due to the COVID crisis. So I started just with that element. Then I did this sort of like drawing of Trump where he looked like a sort of sociopathic sort of Joker figure. So incorporated that as well and some other bits and bobs. So it's a collage digital piece, sort of a collage piece, but also incorporating text drawing. It's basically a mixture of mixed media, I guess, isn't it? Really, is the term.
Yes.
So, but then I thought that'd be a good point for a show. It is quite political, but I mean, these are quite politically fraught times we live in, so there's lots to investigate with that theme, I suppose.
All art is political. All art is.
I don't know about all art, but a lot of it is, yeah, certainly. I mean, like, for example, I don't know if a still life is political, is it? I don't think it's all political. It can't be, I don't think.
If you think of it in terms of an expression of the individual, yes. Which is what most painting is.
Certainly, yeah. That's true.
I don't mean literally as in a form of propaganda or something like that. I don't.
Yeah. So
every work you produce is a statement, regardless of the subject.
That's true. Yeah, I mean,
and that can be interpreted as a political act or a subversive act,
internal
depending on the culture you're living in. Yeah.
So, who are some artists you like that deal with explicitly political themes? Just to go off on a random tangent. Just like any period of time. Could be contemporary or modern or classic.
Whose work was overtly political?
Not overt. Okay, so dealt with politics in some form. I'll make it a bit broader than overtly.
Well, you didn't go for the obvious ones like Picasso with Guernica, or a painting which I think is superior. It's Massacre in Korea from 1951, which is a fantastic painting.
I don't know that painting.
Picasso.
Ah, okay.
It was about the American army crossing from South into North Korea over the 38th parallel, the no man's land. And it's a series of soldiers massacring civilians. It's an amazing painting.
Interesting.
It's been eclipsed by Guernica, but it's a very brilliant painting.
Interesting. Sorry, also Bakker is getting annoyed by a drill that's going off occasionally. He's just trying to join in with his criticisms of art.
And then you've also got the futurists as well. I mean, okay, that's linked to fascism, but it's still political painting. They were great artists.
Well, yeah, well, many of them were actually.
Marinetti.
Yeah, I mean, they're interesting artists for sure. I mean, a lot of them were actually. Didn't they start off on more of an anarchist like political platform, from what I understand of them?
Yeah.
And then it sort of like got. I mean, Marinetti, I think, was very much a propagandist and self-promoter, but yeah, he's a backer.
But I think what I was trying to say earlier is that any single artwork that criticizes or critiques the modern world is, I think, political. If you're criticizing capitalism or consumerism or anything like that, I think it's still politicized.
Well, yeah.
Whether it's the Marxists or the futurists or whatever.
I'd say even, Goya, of course, I'd say he's a very political artist in some respects, in a very universal way, I guess. The way like he documented atrocities that took place. I mean, there's that fantastic painting he did. What's it called? You know, the one where the guy's spreading his arms. I can't remember off the top of my head. The white.
Yes, I know exactly the painting you mean. I just can't think of the title.
He's a very interesting painter because a lot of his work's very dark and psychological. The latest stuff, especially with the witches and everything. Very interesting painter, of a classical painter, a master. And then, well, it's interesting if you like. I live in Russia now, and like obviously a lot of the early 20th century art with the Russians was overtly political, definitely in a sense, because it was obviously post-revolution. You had like agitprop came out of that, Lissitzky, and
constructivism.
Constructivism. So it was literally aligned with the aims of the sort of like, I guess, utopian communist idea that they had of creating a sort of new paradise on Earth.
And a new culture, yeah.
And so, I mean, obviously, because it's like sort of left-wing utopianism that turned really bad. The term, well, not very glib way of putting it, but sort of became repressive in a sense. It definitely did, for certainly. But yeah, so how do you think artists today can respond to the events that are happening around COVID anyway? Broad question, but it's a good one to go with, I suppose. What can we do? Can we, in terms of like doing more virtual shows, because obviously we can't gather as we once did before. I mean, we're sort of doing it with the tunnel where we're doing the live streams, did the virtual gallery a while ago. So we are utilising new methods to get our work out there and communicate interesting ideas to the public. So how do you see that evolving or changing as time goes on, as this crisis continues? Where do you see the crisis going as well? One big question.
Well, the crisis will only be resolved by a vaccine.
Yeah.
I mean, like we discussed before, you can't just keep having lockdowns every few months. You'll destroy civilization.
Maybe it'll become faster now that Trump has COVID. And he'll have
if he has
interest.
It's not just a publicity stunt or some kind of propaganda.
It'd be amazing. Episode. I mean, if he, I don't really think it is, but if it was, that would be an amazingly ignorant, stupid thing to do. Because if it ever came out, the American public, you'd assume, would be pretty annoyed at someone doing that. Their leader, especially. Just a fool. I mean, it would be a.
I mean, we don't know where we're going to go. I mean, the world has fundamentally changed, and what's frustrating me is that people are using it for political gain. It's either the far left or the far right are trying to exploit the situation and turn it to their advantage, which is quite frustrating. So is not a solution.
So give me some examples of what you mean, just because I found that's an interesting statement. Just expand on that, if you will.
Well, you've got the far right holding demonstrations in Westminster saying that wearing a face mask is an abuse of their civil liberties, as if these people believe in civil liberties. But that's why they're trying to project this image. They're defending democracy, they're defending freedom of speech, the right, the individual, which they don't believe in anyway. They want to destroy that. So they're taking advantage of, in that sense of the word, like there's some kind of liberator.
Yeah.
And the far left also just using it as a weapon to attack the government that exists, their failings, which is also unfair as well. you still there?
Yeah. But then, isn't it part of any opposition to? I mean, the Labour. I'm not really up to date with Labour politics, but that's their job, isn't it? I suppose. I mean, I know Labour are a separate thing from the wide spectrum that is the far left, but yeah. So going back to the artistic responses, what are the artistic responses that you've seen from people related to the COVID sort of crisis?
I've only seen responses from the tunnel, what we've been doing over the past 3 months or 2 or 3 months, which is all work that was produced during lockdown in isolation. So it's a lot of work revolving around the idea of isolation.
Yeah.
And anxiety.
Yeah, I've certainly found a lot more.
Very
my own
individual.
work has started
Yeah.
exploring those themes, and also specifically some of the more recent work, which I'll show on screen now when I've edited it afterwards, has got more themes of like excessive. Well, one of them is called excessive computation. And it's basically it takes a picture from that French revolutionary painter David. I can't remember the first name. The one where the guy is dead in the bathtub, basically.
Marat.
Yeah.
David.
Death of Marat, yeah, that's all. And I just modified that a bit to make it so it looks like this guy's just been working so much at his computer that he's just died.
Yeah.
And then also, like I said, the Whilst Rome Burns piece, and some other work as well recently has certainly been at least subconsciously exploring these themes.
I think a lot of artists are exploring their own mental health because, it's had such an impact on people. 3 months of lockdown and 6 months of, virtual isolation.
Yeah.
I think that's what most artists are exploring, really.
Well, yeah, it makes sense.
You're doing things in a much more cerebral way, more of an analysis and a critique. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think other people are just looking at themselves now, this disastrous impact on their mental health, basically.
As you'd expect, we're not meant to be.
Yeah, I know. I'm not criticising. I'm just saying that's.
No. I understand. But I'm just saying. I guess you'd assume that a lot of artists would just take a sort of psychological approach to it, almost like a dreamlike approach, I suppose, in some respects, exploring it through imagery and symbols and stuff. And that's sort of the way I'm going with it, is like through a sort of dreamscape, exploring how it's affecting me and my life, I guess, and just generally the way I think and process the world, I suppose.
It's different for me because my work is about process. I'm a process-based artist, so I just continued making the work that I've always made. That kept me sane. That's my focus. I don't want to call it therapy because that's an awful word, but
it's not an awful word.
Yeah.
It's a very good word, especially for mental health.
Yeah, just art therapy. I was trying to avoid that term, but it's just I just continued with my work, and I just produced more because I was on my own more, so I was more productive.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like sort of like it can.
You were just always going through the process, the routine of work, like Arbark in the studio. Just doggedly pursuing images.
Routine. Yeah. Carry on. Keep calm and carry on.
Yeah.
As it were.
Yeah, because I'm a creature of habit, so I'm very much about sort of routines, like most people are.
Yeah.
But I'm very much so in my case, so I just continued with my normal routine. Well, not exactly normal.
Yeah, that is probably a good thing to do, really, I think.
So my work, I just meant my work, aesthetically didn't actually change at all.
So
it was
talking
same old
about
stuff.
The show itself, it's going to be at 100 Years Gallery. We're going to be streaming it live like we did the last few times.
Yes.
Do we know what performance is going to be happening yet? Have we organised that?
It'll just be Grassy Knoll and Ape, like before, and maybe the Buto dancer, like last time.
So can you talk a bit about them for people that might not be familiar with their work? Just overview of what they do. Some people might not be familiar with their repertoire.
Well, they're London's best kept secret, aren't they? They don't know that kind of London, really.
Avant-garde.
It's improvisation, a performance and music with stream of consciousness poetry that's created by Noel.
Yeah.
That he prepared in advance, which is fantastic. But it's a lot of improvisation. What's interesting about
use of lighting as well, I find.
Yeah. But there's so much harmony in the way they they work. It's almost like it's all been pre-planned, and it isn't. It's just I've never seen a bad performance by them
I've
ever.
seen them live a few times, and they do almost get you into a trance-like state, I find.
Yeah, it's incredible.
It's like
incredible.
A sort of exorcism of well, lots of things, but obviously like
like a purging.
And like a lot of Noel's work, actually. Hello, Noel, if you're listening, by the way. But a lot of Noel's work is kind of a weird mix of like surreal mindscape and also overtly political themes. I think are very much an undercurrent in his work. Like Papa Babu's the thing he's been doing recently, isn't it? And those collaborations with Mark Rathmore, which are really, really stunning. Actually, some of those collaborations I've seen pouring out of those two guys.
I think what's interesting as well is the references to literature that he uses sort of to critique the current situation.
Yeah. Obviously, I mean, he's a literary type.
He's such
So those references obviously flow, and it helps create a sort of almost like a hyperlink. I don't know, like a network of influences that you can draw from and find new inspiration.
It just made me think of Naked Lunch, a literary high.
Yeah.
In a way, it just made me think of that. It is a bit like that.
Yeah, I mean, expanding your, sphere of influences and elements that you take into you is always a good experience, I find, for sure. So, okay. So, I guess we can talk a bit more generally now, I guess. So, do you want to talk about your artwork and just in a general sense, I guess? I know it's hard.
Well, yeah. I mean, well, I just end up repeating myself. I mean, it is very process based. I mean, anybody who doesn't know my work, I've got two sort of subjects, which is the portrait and the crucifixion. I mean, I sort of classify myself as a figurative painter, which I am.
Mm-hmm.
I did have an abstract phase for about 4 years. It's my experimental phase, but it's predominantly been the figure for over 20 years now.
And what draws you to those subjects, especially the crucifixion, which is interesting because I know you're an atheist. I know you don't believe in, or agnostic. I know you don't believe in God. So what about the crucifixion are you drawn to specifically, given the fact that you're not Christian or anything?
The crucifixion changed in its meaning and interpretation in the 20th century. A lot of artists started using it to express philosophical ideas or even political ideas, like Francis Bacon, for example.
Yeah.
Very good example of that.
And what was his mate called? Graham Sutherland did a few.
Yes. Yeah, but Graham Sutherland was a Catholic.
Ah, was he? I didn't know
he was
that,
a practicing Catholic. Bacon was the person who was influenced by existentialism.
Yeah.
And his most famous painting, Three Studies for Figures at the Base of the Crucifixion, 1944.
Yeah.
I think it's one of the great existential paintings because it's just about human behavior rather than anything spiritual.
Yeah,
like Bacon said about that painting, it's just an aspect of human behavior.
A lot of people talk about references to Nazism as well, obviously, because it's just post-war, isn't it? Just post-war, I think. Pretty much, what was it, like a year or so after? I can't remember the exact
1944, just when the camps were being liberated.
So, during it, really.
Yeah. It just interests me that as a removing the spiritual element and just creating an image of that is human, that is basically human. I take my cues from Bacon, like I've already mentioned.
So would you describe yourself as a humanist?
I suppose so.
Yeah.
But it's an attempt to sort of reinvent it in human terms. That's basically what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. So what we
reimagining Catholic art.
Do you want the viewer to ascribe any feeling to the person who's actually suffering the crucifixion, i.e., like empathy, or is it purely a compositional exercise in using the human body as a starting point, a canvas, I guess? If that's not too weird a question.
They're formal studies. I always classify them as constructions. Yeah. And you can basically pour into them whatever you want. They're like vessels in a way. You put yourself into them. I'm not expressing anything of myself. It's
Yeah.
just it's basically an
So is it
analysis of
universal
structure.
man sort of thing?
Yeah, and the portraits are similar as well. They're like the everyman. They can be absolutely anybody.
Yeah.
I paint a portrait, and invariably doesn't look like the person. It's just an interpretation. They can be anybody you want them to be.
So you don't ascribe any
The everyman.
specific like spiritual quality to the work, I suppose, because it's sort of
Well, it
like
depends. It depends how you define spiritual, doesn't it? I mean, what's
yeah.
spiritual? Communing with nature. I mean, doesn't necessarily mean going to church. Does it? You can be
No,
a
no, no.
spiritual person without being religious.
You
I
can be a
think.
pantheist. You can just believe in nature and the universe.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So you're talking about the abstract phrase that you went through. What can you just talk about a bit more about that, maybe?
Not much of that work survives. It was just I started. I was painting portraits, but I was sort of obliterating the image. There are no real facial features, and it was. I learned a lot about technique during that phase.
Yeah,
I did some interesting. I destroyed most of it now, painted over. Some still survives, not much. But it was a crucial part of my development because I developed a lot of techniques that I use now.
yeah, cool.
But I wasn't really expressing anything important then.
So it's more of a sort of formal stepping stone to the work you do now, I suppose. Like a sort of.
Yes, and that's where my palette came from. The
Well,
the
it's interesting actually because I sort of went through a similar phase. I started off as an abstract painter. My early work, I'm self-taught. My early work was nearly completely abstract. It's sort of like I guess derivative of like Kandinsky or like a lot of modernist abstract painters, I guess. I was just learning the ropes, as it were. Not that any, I mean, abstraction to do it really well is really hard. Don't get me wrong, but it's sort of a good starting point to just making marks, learning how paint works, learning how to structure composition, especially for composition, because with an abstract painting, it completely relies on the composition in a lot of ways, and the color especially, to have an impact. Even well, not as much more than figurative painting, obviously, but it has. You know, if you've got an abstract painting with just no compositional quality, then it's just noise. I guess essentially. But
it's just decoration. That's all it is.
yeah, but I mean, like, yeah, it's yeah. So I mean,
So Francis Bacon said it's like watered down emotions. It's not really saying anything there's no composition. It's just shapeless form. It's just
I don't completely agree with that. I mean, like Achille Gorky, for example, is an abstract painter. I think is quite had a lot of emotion and not emotion really. That's a bit twee, but sort of like a lot of depth to his
yeah. It's very
paintings.
emotional. It's very emotional. Definitely, like Pollock's work. His later work is very emotional.
Yeah, that's sort of
Very
funny with Pollock.
intuitive.
I do like his drip works, but I sort of really like his early stuff a lot. That was very influential actually when I was in the early days of my painting. Was Jackson Pollock's early sort of like more Jungian inspired paintings, which sort of got me down
His
the
early
path
work's
of
fantastic.
exploring
Yeah.
all that unconscious and everything else, which I know comes from the surrealists, but there's a direct influence to the surrealists. Me, Roberto Matta as well was an awesome painter. Well, I think he's very undervalued actually in terms of the way that he had these biomorphic forms and these sort of huge, ambitious paintings
I
of
remember his work.
alien
I,
sort of landscapes and
I,
everything
I
else.
let me just clarify something. I think when you break with the figure completely, I think you're just dealing with emotion.
Yeah,
I wasn't suggesting the work didn't have depth. I think it's just emotion and nothing else.
yeah. So
When you break with it entirely, I mean, like you were talking about Pollock's later work, it's just
yeah,
it can be very interesting. I'm not in any way trying to devalue it. I just think the figure is very important to painting. I feel personally. I don't know whether you feel the same way.
well, yeah, I do know. I mean,
I mean, are you a figurative painter then? Do you classify yourself as a figurative painter?
sort of semi-abstract, figurative,
Sort
figurative
of
expressionist, I
in
guess.
between
Yeah, so I mean, I
figuration of.
don't, I do sometimes draw from life and paint from life, but most of the time, I use that as a starting point, and
Yeah.
then usually sketches. So sometimes it's from my imagination completely. Sometimes it's observed actual realities. that then converted into paintings. But most of the time, it's basically semi-abstract. So it's like figurative but abstracted somehow. A bit like Picasso, I guess, or someone like oh god, I've forgotten his name. A British painter. I can't remember his name, but yeah. So it's sort of like a mixture of reality, things from reality, symbols, people, objects, and then I just sort of change it somehow. So yeah. So there's. So, I mean, I do still do abstract paintings. I've not really painted for a while actually recently, just because I've not had any space. Like for about a year and a half actually, over that 2 years maybe. So predominantly most of what I've been doing personally for the last 2 years really has been like drawings and digital art. So digital art's been more what I've been doing the last year. So it's more like at the minute it's sort of like collage and photo manipulation really that I'm doing, which I'll probably turn into paintings once I've got a studio set up here in Moscow, which is where I am now. So yeah, I mean the last works that I did paintings wise were sort of much more like archetypal sort of expressionist paintings, I suppose. So figurative but expressionist. I'll show a few of those on screen if I've got any of them anyway, but yeah. And it'll be interesting to see once I get a studio here, what comes out of me from painting, from going through the quarantine and all the crazy shit that's gone down this year, to be honest.
And also being in a different culture.
Yeah.
With different influences, different reference points.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to at the minute. Like, I've not really done much yet, but I've got some like new Russian books which I'm trying to read, like your old favourites. I've got a few in here, maybe. This one. I've not started it yet, but
I read that a year ago.
yeah. So
Fantastic.
And then
Masterwork.
So like these sort of like trying to learn more about Russian culture and Russian writers and stuff. So I mean, I know quite a lot about Russian art from the past. I used to read a lot about that. It's modern Russian art anyway. Kandinsky and Lazitsky and some poets as well, because I'm quite interested in poetry, like Yesenin and Pushkin and all those guys. But yeah, I mean, I've been started recently actually taking photographs around the estate I'm on, just while I've been out skateboarding, just to see if I can incorporate some of that somehow into the collages. And just as, I mean, I've not done anything with them yet. I only took these photos a few days ago, today and yesterday actually. But we were thinking of it, because I'm doing these like digital collages now, sort of like how can I incorporate those into digital pieces. And something I want to do a lot more actually is like taking my own photography, because in a minute a lot of it's sort of like my own work reworked, or it's famous paintings reworked, or using just random source imagery I find. So I want to try and take more of my own original photos and manipulate them, I think now. I think that'd be quite interesting, just so I've got my own original sort of library of collage materials, if that makes sense. So yeah. Have you ever experimented with collage in your own work, actually?
Yes, many years ago. I've still got some pieces left.
Cool, be interested to see it. I've never seen them before.
I used to take photocopies of my paintings and then just basic black and white photocopies, and then rework them into collages and paint on them. And there's still a few that survive, which I think are quite interesting. I haven't looked at them for many years.
Interesting.
That was a long time ago.
How did you find that process?
It's interesting because they basically were just studies for larger paintings. Even that's what I felt about them, which I never actually realized. I just I've kept them in a folder.
Okay. So would you say again that it was sort of a stepping stone to the style that you do now? Would you say it influenced your current style in any way, shape, or form, like in terms of the process?
In terms of atmosphere, maybe, but not in terms of process. I mean, I did at one point go through a phase where I took old drawings, because I work on card as well, as you know, and I mounted them onto canvas and then worked over the top. That for about 4 years as well, during the abstract phase. So it's like reimagining older pieces.
I've seen some of those actually. I think your big ones, larger works.
Some still survive. So there was a lot of paper actually mixed in with the paint and working over the top of drawings. It was an interesting process, but it meant that I destroyed a lot of my old work doing that.
Yeah. Where do you see? What I mean, are you going to stick to the same format you've been working in, or do you see that you're going to change anything? Do you see any sort of changes emerging in your current style, or are you quite sort of happy with the sort of aesthetic that you're working at currently? It's a broad question.
I'm very happy with it.
Yeah.
No. I'm happy with my work now. And any progress I make is very slow, very gradual. Because, like I said, it's all about process, just going through the same routine again and again and again for months or years. So you progress very slowly.
What's your sort
when
of
you work
thoughts
like
on format then as well? So, because I know you used to do a lot of larger paintings, which you don't do so much anymore. Do you think that's sort of like a false economy, making huge paintings makes a statement, or do you think that that's sort of like irrelevant, really?
Well, I use 3 scales. 1 for the figure and 2 for the portraits, which are quite small, as you know. Anybody knows my work.
Quite personal, yeah.
I don't very often work on a large scale because I find it too problematic, because the proportional systems are different and it's a completely different way of painting.
Yeah.
And there's also a practical element to that, because you can store these smaller pieces so much more easily.
Yeah, I know for myself that I went through a phase of painting big, large things, and it becomes a nightmare. I mean, a lot of them are in my parents' garage, I think, for a minute, the ones that are even left.
Exactly,
I'm glad that I painted those paintings, because it was a learning experience and it was fucking fun, to be honest, just painting large. But to actually store them is just a flipping nightmare.
Exactly, there's the practical problems there, but like I said, it's also the proportional systems are so different. I always struggled with it.
Yeah.
I prefer smaller, more compact work.
I suppose,
and it's also about routines having the same scale.
Because your works are so focused on the face, your features, and even if they're abstracted, that can be a problem, I suppose. Okay, interesting. What else can we cover? So your favourite medium is paint. We've already established that. Have you ever worked with photography or film, or does any of those mediums interest you, or no, just you're a painter?
Painting is my obsession. I've been a painter for a very long time. I mean,
what obsesses you about it?
It's the great tradition of it. I mean, obviously painting is ancient. I mean, it goes back thousands of years.
Yeah.
And it's also to do with culture, because in this country now, for the past 30 years or so, painters have been pushed to the margins, even though they are the majority.
Yeah.
Conceptualism in the 1990s pushed them to one side, and they came out with these slogans that painting was dead, blah, 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 and all this. And it is, because painters are the majority. I really do believe that globally. I think there's more painters than any other type of artist.
The thing is now as well, it's just like, it's almost not as mythology. Like in the past, you had like these sort of mythologies that grew up around painters, like sort of like Picasso is a good example, of course, and his womanizing and everything else. Or, almost. I mean, I guess that's a process of history that happens as well. Like, maybe artists that are alive now in 50 years will be mythologized too, but I don't really feel that there's the same almost cult of personality around painters, which is probably a good thing, actually, if you know what I mean. So you got like very successful painters like Peter Doig, for example. Great paintings. I really like his work. I know hardly anything about the man himself.
Well, I mean, painters aren't as important as they used to be, are they? I mean, That changed with photography in the 19th century,
true.
but more importantly, with cinema
But then
in the 20th
Picasso,
century. That's the
Picasso,
great,
I suppose, with Cubism, sort of responded to the development of photography, and a lot of other painters as well. Picasso's quite an obvious one, I suppose, but
yeah.
even
So
Turner, even
painters,
Turner, I think, was around when the early photography was getting developed, wasn't he?
I just think over the past century or so, painters have constantly had to sort of reinforce their position to justify themselves and constantly reinvent themselves, and that's what makes a successful painter. But I think the main means of communication artistically now is cinema. That influences people more than painting does.
As an art medium,
I mean,
yeah,
cinema affects the way people talk, the way they dress, the way the way they behave.
it's a huge
Cinema
cultural
is a
force for
great,
sure. Yeah, even more so than books, though. Even I'd say.
because it's so accessible.
Games as well, even in some respects, I think.
Games, media, that's replaced the role of painting that the painters had, in the 16th century. They were the main communicators and storytellers. They were the great visual people of their time, and that's sort of been replaced now.
So painting has a different place in society now, I guess.
Yeah,
do you think
it's still very important.
On the sidelines, and how do you think that will change, or will it change?
I don't think it will change. I think the way technology is progressing, I think it will just stay on the sidelines forever. I think.
Is that a challenge to painters to sort of like pick up?
I think it makes it exciting because you have to constantly reinvent your position as a painter. You have to do something new. You have to constantly challenge yourself. I find it stimulating.
Yeah,
it doesn't upset me at all.
It's a challenge.
So I think to be a really good painter now, you just have to constantly reinvent what you're doing and the way you think about it, and reinvent yourself in a way.
Yeah. Okay.
I absolutely love cinema. I think what's wonderful about cinema is, and it's so accessible on so many different levels. You can approach it from a formalist point of view, or just an entertainment point of view, or a philosophical point of view. I think cinema is wonderful.
So it's a great,
and it's just getting more and more advanced and more complex and more visually stunning. I don't think painting can ever compete with that. Really, I don't think.
I know this obviously from knowing you. I know that you're very influenced by Tarkovsky's films. So I know that already. So is there any other filmmakers that you're influenced by, maybe even directly in your painting as well?
He influences my painting directly. I can't think of any filmmaker that would directly influence, apart from Tarkovsky. No.
Well,
many filmmakers I like.
He's well known for his sort of textual quality of his cinema, isn't he? And also,
they're very dreamlike.
The cinematography as well is stunning in some of his films. All of his films, really, I guess. There's always that. Wasn't he a photographer or something, like trained or something? So he's got that composition.
He took Polaroids as well, yeah.
Do you think there's any like sort of influence when you're talking about the technological changes that are happening in the world? Does that ever have any sort of influence in your own work? Do you ever respond to those themes, even if it's subconsciously or unconsciously? Do you think? Because I'm just from my perspective, like I've seen. There were older works. But there's some of your older works where the humanoid figures seem almost like aliens or robots. Not the recent work, that's very much more human. I'm thinking specifically of some older pieces where there was like almost a robotic sort of like feeling to the forms, the humanoid forms. They were humanoid, but almost like in a similar way to like Wyndham Lewis or something like that, I guess. Is that something that you like? So I guess it's sort of like transhumanism, like post-humanism. Is that something you're constantly aware of? Do you reject that statement, or how do you just riff on that?
I think for the first 15 years of my career, my work could be described as robotic. I
didn't mean it in a negative sense, by the way.
No. It was very science fictional, to be honest. And there are still some that survived, and you can see that. It's an analysis, certainly. But now my work is I've just sort of matured as an artist, and they're just more painterly. It's more about marks and constructing an image out of marks. They become more concerned with painting as a process accumulating marks, rather than before it was very linear.
So you're
And I was
recording
looking at
people in
structure
time.
and reinventing structure and reimagining structure. I'm not really doing that so much now. Now it's about letting the paint
Do you ever?
dictate what
This
it
is
will
something I
be.
don't know actually, because I know that you often do portraits of your friends, like you've done ones of me, Julia,
Yeah,
Jessica.
yeah. I paint everybody.
Do you ever get people to sit in your studio to do those works? So you study them directly from life?
Not anymore. 20 years ago, I used to do a lot of life drawing. A lot of
Do you think that's something you'd revisit just to see if? Because I guess you work from references at the minute when you're doing
I use
portraits of
photographs. Yeah,
portraits of people you know. Would you ever be open to perhaps having someone in your studio just sitting there, then you record them? Would you think it would have a take on a different quality, as in like how you use mark making to record them, as it were, in space and time, if you want?
oh, definitely. Yeah. There's no harm in actually going back to an earlier process, an earlier method, as long as you can build on it and expand on it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And like maybe combining the two methods, I suppose, like Letters of Vincent Van Gogh. So
I'm sure you said you'd read them at some point because I'm
bits
reading them
and
at the
bobs.
moment.
There's an archive online which I've read, and I went to the retrospective at the Royal Academy, which featured.
Oh, 2010
They
was that?
sort of like structured the entire exhibition around his letters. So
Yeah, I didn't see
uh,
that.
I've not read in depth to them, but I know a lot of his letters were obviously to his brother Theo, exploring their relationship, which is a very deep relationship, as sort of like established.
Oh yeah, he's just so honest. I mean, he's living with a prostitute when he was in The Hague. He was pregnant, and he just completely was open about that. And
There's
he
no harm
tried
in that, is there?
syphilis as well.
Well, there's harm in syphilis,
No, but
but
yeah, but in the 19th century, that was taboo because obviously Van Gogh came from a religious family, and he was a pastor at one point. So
yeah,
it's interesting just to see how he sort of rejected organized religion and then sort of became this sort of religious painter. And
yeah.
it's so beautiful the way he talks about his paintings. The struggle of painting outdoors in the
Well, he
wind and
was very
rain.
religious for a while, wasn't he? Because he wasn't he
Yeah,
had his heart set on becoming a.
he,
He became a missionary, didn't he, for a while?
he was a pastor
Yeah. Uh,
for about 2 years. He undertook religious studies.
then didn't he fail his studies or something?
Yeah, he failed all of his studies, whether it was art or religion. He just left basically
Yeah.
because he was too restless to be sort of indoctrinated, I suppose, whatever you want to call it. He wanted to be himself. They're so beautiful. They really are. They're like literature.
Yeah, I mean, he's a very well-read man, wasn't he? Shakespeare
Mm.
and all sorts.
It's like Simon Sharma said about him. He was a life of the mind. He was so internalized. There was so much activity in his mind. He was just constantly absorbing new information, new ideas, not just visually, but intellectually. He was a very sensitive man. And I think that was part of the problem. He was too sensitive.
To the world, yeah, to
I think
the
that was his
external.
destruction in a way.
Yeah, we had manic depression or epilepsy or bipolar or whatever you want to call it, really, as well. Then that's yeah, which I have as well. Well, not epilepsy, but bipolar. But that's a whole other discussion. But yeah, yeah,
Well, it's because of him they created the link between creativity and bipolar because of his
uh,
letters and the way he behaved. I mean, do you think there's a link? I know it's a very
well, I
personal
mean,
question, but do you think are all bipolar people awful?
I don't think it makes you any better or worse than the other artist. I think it's just certainly doesn't make you better. It doesn't. I don't subscribe to the tortured artist mythos completely, but there is a provable link certainly between mood disorders and certain forms of creativity. Certainly between there's there's a book actually by a psychologist which explores this. What's it called? Not the Unquiet Mind. That's her other book. I'm thinking of the Kay Redfield Jameson. Basically, she's a psychologist. She has bipolar herself, and she sort of proved that through history, there's a lot of historical figures: Virginia Woolf, Vincent Van
Hmm.
Gogh, Byron, all these sort of figures who certainly had diagnosable mood disorders by today's standard, who were also extremely creative. I mean, Virginia Woolf certainly had bipolar, or something similar to that. I mean, obviously she killed herself, and she was a very creative, ahead of her time mind as well, in loads of respects. Um, and there's certainly a link between writers, I know, and painters as well. Obviously, Vincent van Gogh's a common example, but Ernst Ludwig Kirchner as well, German expressionist. I mean, he killed himself actually in her. I mean, he probably had some sort of mood disorder. I think Edvard Munch certainly suffered from anxiety and depression. But I think they probably created despite their disorders, if that makes sense. Because the disorder, by definition, is a inability to function. So I think there are certain benefits in some abstract sense to having a mania or hypermania. Well, hypermania, not so much mania, but hypermania, because you're excessively productive and you feel that you're more creative. It doesn't necessarily equate to being more creative, though. I wouldn't say it necessarily equates to being more creative. It just means that you've got more energy. So, in a sense, that could lead to more. But I think I think having it myself, I think I'm creative despite the bipolar, if that makes sense.
That's the way I feel about it. I think you can separate, especially painting, from mental illness of any kind. Yeah, I was just thinking about it recently. I mean,
there is obviously art brut and outsider art, which is
where
the links are obvious. Like, if you're an outsider artist, usually that means you've got some sort of schizophrenia or whatever, like some sort of mental health problem. And I think schizophrenics especially can create some very otherworldly sort of like patterns in their work. So there is certainly a link there between creating sort of like outlandish compositions and outlandish sort of completely way outside the box works. But the thing is with something like schizophrenia, like if someone has, you've known people with schizophrenia. If you know someone with severe schizophrenia, like chronic schizophrenia, it's not really a good thing for the individual. It's a terrible affliction. And thankfully we've got medications these days which help control these.
It's interesting that you say that, because I went to university years ago with a man who had acute schizophrenia. He was actually an engineer by profession, and he became an artist later on. Actually became very ill, very severely ill. And it's interesting because his drawings, he did these architectonic forms and these beautiful biro drawings. He had sketchbooks full of these drawings, and they're wonderful. Yet his paintings were awful. They were the worst paintings I ever saw, and it's to do with how his brain processed the information, because for him these were like masterpieces and we couldn't see it. Everybody else realized he was a terrible painter. He didn't understand paint, but he could draw beautifully. And that was part of his condition.
How were they were they just like, was it just the way they layered it, or just
he just didn't understand paint. They were just, if you saw them you would see how terrible they were. But his drawings were exquisite. These exquisitely beautiful biro architectonic form.
I mean, like this is
so that was part of his condition, the way it blinded him to painting and understanding paint.
I think because from a lot
of
schizophrenic art, a lot of it is very pattern based and very much fine detail and sort of like very. I mean, this is a generalization. I know it's not true in every respect, but someone like. Alfred Wallace, was it? Adolphe Wolfe, that's the guy I'm thinking of. He did these weird, like, musical. He was a very strange man. He had schizophrenia and just messed up, very messed up man. But he did these sort of like paintings in a psychiatric institution, which were just unlike anything you'd ever see anywhere else. I mean, sort of like poor clay, but blown up 10 times more abstract and strange. So I think there's a lot of pattern. I guess that's like how, I mean, the schizophrenic mind doesn't. The thing with it, I guess, is that it's too much noise. It's like there's so much noise in the head that they see patterns in places where there is no patterns. Often, if you're delusional, if you're someone who's a delusional schizophrenic, they're going to see patterns.
It fascinates me, the link between painting and perception, because if you look at the work of Syd Barrett, I mean, he had schizophrenia. I'm pretty sure he did. Yeah, but his paintings, some of them are really beautiful. The ones that survive, I mean, he destroyed most of his work.
As well. He was trained.
and he's very varied. His output. He's a very interesting painter, and
musician as well. Fantastic. I love the early Floyd stuff.
yeah,
And solo Sid Barrett stuff actually, especially "Golden Hair." That's an awesome song. Lean out your window, golden hair.
and it's just interesting. Sometimes the illness can interfere with the process of painting, or it doesn't interfere at all in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
It's just I just find it really interesting. It's something that's perplexed me for years.
I mean, for me personally, yeah, I have bipolar. I've had bad times and shit, but I take meds to control all that. And
Yeah,
if I didn't take those, I would not be a productive artist. I would be
yeah, you won't be able to function. Yeah,
not properly anyway. No, I wouldn't be able to function in society as I can sort of manage today. So yeah, there is a link, I think. But summarised, I think there is a link, but it's not something. It can be problematic when I think people think they need to have something like that to be an artist. This is bollocks.
exactly. They feel they need to be a drug addict or an alcoholic to be the great artist, the great outsider artist, the self-destructive artist, which is a load of nonsense.
Yeah, of course.
It's just you can't. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of artists and painters who either don't do drugs, don't do alcohol, don't drink, don't have any mental illnesses, who have produced amazing work.
I've known quite a few. It just interests me.
Yeah.
The relationship between
And
your
I
mental
think
state and pain.
often, I mean, obviously, like arts can often be kind of, for want of a better word, sort of bohemian, but that's due to the nature of the work, of course, because they're generally speaking, a lot of painters would be categorized, I guess, as like working class because they don't earn a lot of money. You can't earn a lot of money doing it unless you're really in the top echelons of 1%. So
It's exactly to be like me. To be a painter, I live in poverty. I don't really want it like that, but I have to be a productive painter. I have to be on the breadline. But the other thing about painting, it's very solitary. It's hours and hours of being alone in the studio with just you and the work. Like for you, me, lots of painters, lots of artists generally, actually. It's like spending a whole day or several days on your own.
yeah,
It's a very solitary pursuit. It really is. I mean, that's just the nature. I mean, same for being a designer as well, or anything like that. It's.
well, I mean, similarly, just take off at a random tangent. Like I'm a developer as well as my day job, programmer, and that's a very solitary pursuit. In a different way, it's much more mental and abstract, but it's well, yes and no. But I spend most of my working time at the computer, solving problems, basically. And, yeah.
That's what painting is, solving problems. I mean, that's a very broad thing to say, but it is on one basic level. It is the same.
Yeah,
It's a series of solving problems.
Never resolve themselves as well, either, do they? There's a Picasso?
No, because one problem gets replaced by another. That's how you develop, regardless of what medium you're using.
Yeah. Okay.
Doing a